Right, so the first method I want to talk about that's got proven results with Fjuka in winter is feeding the bait with ground bait. Now, this isn't just a winter tactic. Those who watched Vic Bush on our Fjuka road trip down at Avalon Fisheries will have seen the massive bag of bream and skimmers that he caught feeding Fjuka 2-in-1 in ground bait. But now we've got a new kid at the party that lends itself even more to this way of feeding, and that's these bad boys, the Fjuka micros. Now you can see I've kept these in a clear plastic bag today. Quite important that on days like today when it's damp, because you want to keep them dry, just as you would with normal micro pellets once you prepared them. You don't want them getting wet because they go really sloppy. So I always store them in a bag. But the fact that they're smaller and break down quicker lends themselves even more to feeding with ground bait. So what I've done today is I've mixed up a small amount of the Sonia Bates Pro Thatcher's original mix. This is a lovely fish meal ground bait. It's quite fine, it's not terribly high in feed content, but what it does is it carries a quantity of the micros down to the bottom, and it breaks up and creates a carpet of feed on the bottom, but without too much rich feed particles in there. So it's totally different to, for example, feeding a full pot of Fjuka or a full pot of pellets. You've got a bed of attractants on the bottom, but not too much rich feed particles in with them. So in winter, when, as I've spoke about, the fish often aren't feeding as well as they might do in summer because the water's cooler and the metabolism of the fish is slower, what that means is it gives an area for the fish to come in and graze on. And then in the middle of that, we've obviously got these lovely bright Fjuka micro pellets, and right in the middle of them we'll also have our hook bait, which might be a Fjuka micro on the hook, or it might be a Fjuka 2-in-1 in one of the bigger sizes. On a really good day we could even try a fluorescent Fjuka neon to give a real standout bait. But I would say, in order of hardness, if it's a particularly tough day, try one of the micros on the hook. If it's a little bit better and you want it to be a bit more selective, why not try one of the 2-in-1s on the hook? And if you really wanted to pick out a big bonus fish, try one of the Fjuka neons on the hook. Now this tactic lends itself particularly well to venues where there's a lot of skimmers and F1s. Skimmers seem to love ground bait, especially fish meal ground bait, and they love Fjuka bait as well. So it's a brilliant combo on venues with a mixed head of skimmers and other fish. Now the other great thing about feeding Fjuka bait in this way is it's a great throwaway line, and what I mean by that is you don't need to do a lot with it. Once you've potted it in, you can cup it anywhere in your peg, out the way. I'd always recommend somewhere in the deepish water, down the middle of the lake somewhere. You can literally leave it and keep dropping over the top of it, and because you've got that bed of attractants there on the bottom, often while you're away fishing somewhere else, fish will find that bait, settle over it, and then you can drop on it and catch a couple of fish quite quickly. So it's a great throwaway line. On other days, you'll find that the fish settle over it really well, and you might want to make it the mainstay of your attack. It's something to experiment with, it's something to try. And if you find it worked well on your local water, you can do it on more than one line. Because today we're experimenting here at Weston Pools, I'm going to put it just to my left, out the way, in the deeper water, and we'll put a ball in to start with and see whether the fish settle over it. Now, a couple of final points when it comes to feeding ground bait. First of all, how I've mixed it. I'm not going to go into great lengths about this because there's loads of videos out there about how to mix ground bait, but all I'd say is mix it on the damp side. Now, I've taken my time with this. It's taken me about probably 20 minutes to get the right consistency here, and what I've done is I've mixed it, added a little bit of water, let the fish meal soak that water up, added a little bit more water, and I've ended up with a consistency that's fairly damp, so I know that's going to go down to the bottom and break down once it's got there. Really take your time, you'll get out what you put in terms of time taken getting the right ground bait mix. I've then added a few of the Fjuka micros to it. Again, I'd say a golden rule would be, if it's a hard venue, put less of the micros in the mix, because obviously micros essentially equal feed. If it's a little bit better and you think the fishing's going to be quite good, you can put more micros in the mix, increase the feed ratio in effect, and that'll mean that you'll hold fish in your peg for longer. And I extend that philosophy to the amount of bait that I feed as well. So today I'm expecting it to be quite a tough day, and I'm just wanting to try this out, so I'm just going to put the one ball in. If I knew that the fish love ground bait and there was a big head of skimmers and bream in the lake, I might put 3 or 4 balls in, and I might then be inclined to top up as well with ground bait through the day. And that's something you can do anyway. It's that golden age-old saying in fishing, you can put it in but you can't take it out. So always err on the side of caution. Put one ball or one pot in at the start if you're not sure, and top up as you go through the day. But if you know the fish like ground bait in your local lake, don't be afraid to put a bit more bait in at the start and let the fish settle over it. I want to talk to you today about a brilliant way of feeding and fishing with Fjuka bait in winter, and that's to feed it with micro pellets. Now, I'm sure you sat there thinking, when Fjuka bait do their own lovely bright coloured micro pellets that stand out and obviously work well on their own as a bait, why would you want to feed it with standard fishery micros? Well, I'll tell you why. The reason is it's a mixture of the familiar and the not so familiar for the fish. Now, these micro pellets probably have been the staple fish feed on most commercial fisheries for the last 10 years or more. They're a mega successful winter feed bait that we all know works well, and fishing maggots over micros or soft expanders over micros has been one of the most popular and successful commercial fishing winter methods of all time. So what we're doing here is harnessing that tried and tested power of micro pellets and mixing it with the standout pulling performance of Fjuka bait and sensate attractant. So how do we go about doing it? Well, first and foremost, obviously most commercial fisheries have their own micro pellets, and it's important to obviously use them where specified so you don't get in trouble. Preparation wise, again, there's lots of videos about how to prepare micros. I'm not going to go into too much detail. Suffice to say, obviously take your time. When you see the micros starting to discolour in the water, when you see them starting to cloud, that often means they've been in the water long enough, and that's the time to drain them off so that the micros remain intact without going mushy. That's what you want. You want your pellets to be intact like this, so that they're soft, you can squeeze them together, they're going to form together in a little ball, but also they still hard in the middle and they haven't broken down totally and gone all mushy. That's what you're looking for, really. So what I've done today, I've prepared about half a bag of the Weston Pools micro pellets, and there's two ways I like to feed them, just to give you two different options. Again, it's well worth experimenting with both these ways of feeding on your local commercial, because you might find that one's better than the other, and it's not until you do that and find out what's best for you that you'll be able to put a proper plan together to suit the venue that you're attacking. So first and foremost, just micros straight as they come out the bag. Now, as you can see, these are fairly dull. They've got the black tracer pellets in, but other than that, they're a fairly dull brown colour. So imagine how well a bright piece of Fjuka bait is going to stand out over the top of these. Whether it be a Fjuka neon, big bright fluorescent bait on a day when you're trying to pick out a bonus fish, or if you're trying to catch a bit of everything, look at the Fjuka micros themselves. You can put those on the hook. They're a little bit larger than a standard fishery micro, and again, they stand out absolutely beautifully. So that gives you maximum impact in terms of creating a standout hook bait over a tried and tested feed bait in the micro pellets. But another really good tactic, and something I've had a lot of success doing, has been mixing the Fjuka micros with the standard fishery feed micros to create this sort of thing, a really bright, vibrant jamboree of micros mixed in with the fishery feed pellets. And the added advantage of doing this is you flavour your fishery micros with the sensate attractant that's impregnated into the Fjuka bait. So all I've done here is prepared the micros as usual. When I've drained off the water, so they're still a little bit damp and a little bit sticky, I've added in the Fjuka micros and mixed them round, and that's just caused the Fjuka micros to go slightly sticky, to leak a little bit of sensate attractant out. And again, if I squeeze that, just one-handed nip, you can see we could feed that in deeper water if we wanted to, and it'd go to the bottom and break down there. So it gives you the option of feeding either loose in shallowish water out of a kinder pot, or squeeze it into a ball and feeding in slightly deeper water. And again, over the top of that, we can fish one of these micros on the hook, one of the brighter neons, or a piece of 2-in-1. It's just about playing about with those two different modes of feeding and finding out what's best on a given day. So how do we feed micros? Well, I've got to urge caution here, guys, because Micros, as I've said, are a particularly potent feed bait, but they're also a great way of spoiling your peg if you're not careful, because they can bring an awful lot of fish into your peg and the fish can then get preoccupied with the micros. So always err on the side of caution. I use a pole mounted sprinkle pot to feed these generally, so on a typical session I probably feed, I don't know, 20 or so micros with a few of the Fjuka micros mixed in with them, about that sort of quantity. I drip feed that into the peg to start with, fish a piece of Fjuka on the hook and just see what we caught doing that. Obviously times when I might feed more would be if the fishing was good, or if I found that feeding a quantity of bait and then resting it was best on a given day, which sometimes it is. So you've got two options there. Always start on the side of caution if you're not sure. Don't feed too many of these. A little bit of bait goes a long way. But if you find out your venue responds well to them and you want to feed multiple lines, as I've said, that's a great way of maximising what you catch from your peg in the winter. Then you can obviously feed a little bit more heavily. But as a start off of 10, always urge on the side of caution. Micros are a proven fish attractor, proven fish catcher, and by merging them with the power of Fjuka, you can have some great winter catches. One of my favourite ways to catch fish in the winter is fishing through the water. It's an absolutely deadly tactic on commercials, and the great thing about it, it catches fish of all species. So it might be a day when the F1s want to feed but the carp don't, you'll catch F1s. It might be a day when the silvers want to feed but nothing else does, you'll catch silvers. This is my banker tactic on commercials in winter. First thing I want to say about it relates to the rig that I choose to use, and it's all about presenting a bait as it falls through the water. So I'm going to show you here, I've got strung out shot, probably 2/3 of the way down the line. These are number 11s. What a nice light 4x12 float, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 number 11 shot spread out the last 2/3 of the rig. And that's just to create that fall. So when I'm loose feeding bait, my hook bait is being presented as naturally as possible alongside those loose offerings. I know 13 main line on, which is quite robust, but then crucially a nice light 010 hook length. Again, this time of year the water's clear, the water's cold. You've got to present your hook bait as naturally as possible, and the lighter the line you can get away with fishing and still land what you hook, the more fish you'll catch. So obviously when you're fishing light lines and small hooks, and the hook by the way is an 18 Guru F1 pellet, you need to match it to an elastic that's forgiving. And this Preston 8 Jura Holler is absolutely perfect in that regard. Dead soft, dead forgiving, from a 6-ounce roach to a 6-pound carp. Whatever you hook on this, you're not going to bump it and you're probably going to land it. So it's all about scaling down the tackle to match what you're trying to do, which is catch everything. So how do you go about deciding where to fish when you're trying to build a peg and catch through the water? Well, the first and most obvious thing is you've got to do it where you can comfortably loose feed. Now today that's about 14 metres up to the tree in front of me. The great thing about these new Fjuka micros which I've got here is they are quite dense. Even though they're small, they're quite dense and they fly very well. You can catapult these comfortably 14 metres. So you can still fish quite long with these and build a peg, even though they're a nice non-selective bait that everything chooses to eat. So I'm fishing 14.5 metres. The second thing is do it towards cover. I've got a nice tree out there. Now clear water, as I said, means fish will hug cover more than ever. So marginal cover can be great. Sometimes loose feeding down the edge can be great this time of year. Or if you've got trees or anything like that in front of you, then make the most of it and loose feed up to that. And then obviously you can present your strung out rig alongside that. Make sure that where you're fishing isn't too close to the danger zone though, especially if you expect the fishing to be relatively good. The last thing you want to be doing is spending half the day untangling from the tree or pulling for a break when you manage to hook a branch. I always keep my Fjuka micros in a little plastic bag, especially on days like this when it's raining, because you don't want them getting wet. If they get wet, they stick together and they don't loose feed as accurately via catapult, so you need to keep them relatively dry in a bag. Now, because we're trying to get fish to compete, the key is to build your peg. And by that I mean start off by feeding little and often. I'm talking 5 micros every couple of minutes until you know how many fish are in your peg. Loose feed, feed to your bites. If you find that you don't get many bites, cut back the quantity that you feed, but still feed fairly regularly. You might feed 2 or 3 micros until you find out that the fish are there. What tends to happen with this kind of method is your swim gets better and better. So even if you have to feed 2-3 micros to start with, as the fish come into your peg and find your bait, and as the fish start competing, because there's not a lot of bait in your peg will get stronger and stronger as that competition between the fish grows and grows. And you might eventually end up feeding far more heavily and fishing a bigger, more selective bait like a Fjuka neons on the hook, or a bigger piece of the 2-in-1. So build your peg, that's the first thing. If you can, if it's a difficult day, it can be really good to have other lines on the go, maybe a ground bait line down the middle or a line with micro pellets. Have them lines on the go so you can fish there while you're building your loose feed line up. So it might be that you have the first hour fishing down the middle over ground bait while you're loose feeding your micro line. Or it might be that you start on micros, have a ground bait line as another throwaway line, and a line where you can loose feed pellets. Give yourself options, that's absolutely key in winter. But this tactic is an absolute banker, and you'll generally find it gets stronger and stronger as the session goes on. Loose feed little and often, get the fish competing, and fish a nice strong rig. So wherever they are in the water column, you're going to catch them.